Hi everyone, welcome back to Geniusstar Business Club. In today's video, we're going to break down one of the most fundamental concepts in economics, the supply curve. What does it really show? Why does it slope upward? And how do producers actually decide how much to sell at different prices? Whether you're studying for an exam or just trying to understand how markets work in real life, this video will give you a clear and practical explanation. Let's get into it. Okay, before we dive in, here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. First, we'll start with the law of supply and the supply curve diagram, understanding why the curve slopes upward and what that actually means in practical terms. Next, we'll look at the difference between individual supply and market supply, highlighting on how one producer's decision compares to the combined decisions of the entire market. Then, we'll clarify a concept that students often mix up: the difference between a movement along the supply curve and a shift of the supply curve. Finally, we'll explore the non-price determinants of supply. The other factors, besides price, can cause supply to increase or decrease. By the end of this video, you should have a clear and structured understanding of how supply works in theory and in real markets. Let's start with the law of supply. The law of supply states that as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity supplied by producers also increases. And when the price falls, quantity supply decreases. This happens in ceteris paribus, meaning when other factors remain constant. On the diagram on the right, you can see the supply curve and also the price being on the vertical axis, while the quantity supplied is on the horizontal axis. The upward sloping line shows this positive relationship between price and quantity supply. Higher price provides greater incentive for firms to produce and sell more, mainly because the potential profit increases. We'll also be talking about shifts later on, but for now, let's just stick to the supply curve. Next, the individual and market supply. The individual supply refers to how much one producer is willing and able to sell at different prices. For example, in this table, you can see how Ben and Jerry each respond to changes in the price of ice cream cones. As price increases, each of them supplies more, which follows the law of supply. Market supply, on the other hand, is simply the sum of all individual supplies at each price level. So at every price, we add Ben's quantity and Jerry's quantity together. That total gives us the market supply. Graphically speaking, this means the market supply curve is derived by horizontally adding the individual supply curves. It represents the combined behavior of all producers in the market. So remember, individual supply means one firm, while market supply means all firms being added together. Okay, now let's clarify on one of the most important distinctions, the movement along the supply curve versus a shift of the supply curve. A movement along a movement along the supply curve happens when the price of the good itself changes. This leads to a change in quantity supply, shown as a movement from one point to another on the same curve. The curve doesn't move, only the position on the curve changes. In contrast, a shift of the supply curve happens when non-price factors change. This could be things like production costs, technology, taxes, or the number of firms in the market. When these factors change, the entire curve shifts either to the right, meaning supply increases, or to the left, meaning supply decreases. So remember, price change means a movement along the supply curve, while non-price change leads to a shift of the whole curve. So, what are the causes of a shift in supply curve? Other than price factors, we also have non-price determinants of supply. First, changes in the cost of factors of production, such as labor, energy, or transport. If production cost increases, firms are less willing or able to produce at each price, so supply decreases and the curve shifts left. If costs fall, supply increases and the curve shifts right. Second, taxes and subsidies. A tax increases production costs, which reduces supply. On the other hand, a subsidy lowers costs and encourages firms to produce more, therefore increasing supply. Finally, are uncertain changes, especially in markets like agriculture. For example, unpredictable weather conditions can significantly affect output. Bad weather may reduce supply, while favorable conditions can increase it. Continuing with other non-price determinants, let's look at three more important factors. First, changes in technology. When technology improves, production becomes more efficient. This lowers costs and allows firms to produce more at every price level, so supply increases and the curve shifts to the right. Second, the number of firms in the market. If more firms enter the industry, total market supply increases. If firms leave the market, however, supply decreases. Remember, market supply is the sum of all individual firms, so the number of producers matters. Finally, prices of related goods, which can be explained through joint supply and competitive supply. In joint supply, producing one good automatically produces another. For example, refining crude oil produces both petrol and diesel. If one becomes more profitable, firms may increase production, therefore increasing the supply of both goods. In competitive supply, however, resources can only be used to produce one good at a time. So, if the price of one good rises, firms shift resources towards it, therefore reducing the supply of the other good. Okay, before we end the lesson here, let's quickly summarize what we've covered so far. First, the law of supply. It tells us that when price increases, quantity supplied also increases. But when price decreases, quantity supplied falls. We've also distinguished between individual supply, which refers to one producer, and market supply, which is the total supply from all producers added together. Next, we clarified the difference between a movement along the supply curve and a shift of the supply curve. Before, we have a diagram of the supply curve, and here we have explained the causes towards these uh, movements and shifts. For example, a price change causes a movement along the same curve, while changes in non-price factors cause the entire curve to shift. Finally, we look at key non-price determinants of supply, including production costs, related goods, taxes and subsidies, expectations of future prices, technology, and the number of firms in the market. That brings us to the end of today's lesson on the supply curve. We hope this video strengthened your overall understanding of supply and how economists analyze it in real market context. Thank you so much for watching and learning with Geniusstar Business Club. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and follow us for more comics and business contents. See you in the next lesson. Bye bye.